By 5:30 a.m., as fighting by this point had essentially boiled down to one specific area, as the entire battle space within a 5-hour span had rapidly been captured by the PLA, as there are 24,500 troops in the area, with more off the map of their 288th Light Infantry Division's 13th Light Armored Brigade, which didn't count within this battle space. This, plus the troops just off map, were half of the 68th PLA Group Army's total forces, as the heaviest formations of the 68th PLA Group Army had crushed Fort Hood rapidly within a 4-hour span, with very heavy Russian units from within its 2nd Combined Arms Army, including its 16th Tank Division, who by now had contributed 2 of its comprising battalions, as it had many more, into this battle space as they arrived in the area by 5 a.m. And by 5:30 a.m. were taking up positions along the line of contact that had formed completely around the downtown area. As Waco, for the most part, had rapidly fallen to the PLA, the downtown would form a nucleus of the area's defenses. As the outer areas had fallen in short order, the downtown would be a tough nut to crack for certain reasons, as not every area in America had access to the types of specialty professions that were within this particular area, including combat engineers who had made it into the downtown perimeter to begin with their equipment, who survived the intensive artillery strikes and loitering munition strikes, having had already lost some of the grouping of mixed unit personnel's vehicles and personnel en route, as well as this grouping of armed reactionary civilians that had been over 200 but now was much less at approximately 120. Both had ran into this area together as the mixed units moved up from the Fort Hood area. Many had been quickly destroyed by elements of the 38th Infantry Brigade in the southwest quadrant of the battle space, with also the Combat Engineer Battalion of the 8th Independent Brigade not only destroying a well-fortified militia compound and the forces that inhabited it, but also a mixed American unit that had moved under I-35 and entered the area, having been rapidly destroyed as well by the combat engineers, leaving only this small mixed American military element of active duty troops from Fort Hood Army forces to get into the downtown and assist and take control of the defenses. Before their arrival, the trapped 143rd Infantry Regiment had already taken charge of the defenses before the arrival of the combat engineers from within this mixed unit, as they had already started filling sandbags and having their support elements with their LMTV trucks truck the sandbags to the areas they intended on defending, as they were already fully aware the PLA was fully surrounding them very early on in the fighting. As a result, many of the armed reactionary civilians had partaken in assisting with the defenses, even under heavy artillery shelling, as the downtown took enormous barrage of artillery fire from the rocket artillery comprising the Artillery Battalion from within the 8th Independent Brigade, comprised of PHL-81 multiple launch rocket systems, which are heavily destructive 122mm artillery systems, although not nearly as destructive as the 300mm systems. However, a firing battery and even a full battalion of these would lay waste to enormous areas, and they would do so in many parts of the Waco metro area, as many portions of the city had received heavy shelling, including in the southwest of it, and also areas in the north, but mostly the downtown, with limited other areas being hit as well by artillery fire from the 155mm PCL 181s that equipped the Artillery Battalion of the 13th Light Armored Brigade within the 288th Light Infantry Division, essentially serving as its divisional artillery force, while the 38th Infantry Brigade had the also very powerful PLL Toad towed PLL 66 howitzers that comprised its firing batteries, which made up its battalion. As the artillery forces all fired upon the downtown area, a creeping barrage had hit enormous portions of the city, not only eliminating over 1,000 of its defenders, most of them being part of the 143rd, leaving only 1,000 left by this point, but had wiped out tens of thousands of civilians who hadn't as of yet fled the city, non-combatants for the time being. They had been all eliminated in the shelling and heavy artillery barrage. As the armed reactionary civilians who wanted to fight right away had assisted the 143rd in filling sandbags at a rapid pace, as it only took 200 men filling sandbags from the city parks digging to achieve a massive production of sandbags that could be driven to the perimeters and established to build emplacements for personnel and even heavier weapons like machine guns or anti-tank systems. As this started to take shape and the combat engineers arrived in short order at about an hour and a half after the invasion had begun by 1:30 sharp, having entered the downtown, they quickly took over the defenses and started to use their heavier equipment to plow rubble into certain places, build heavily fortified rubble emplacements, including machine gun nests, and also digging trenches with their earth movers at a rapid pace, and also plowing the rubble with their plows on the front of their M1150 engineering vehicles. These could dismantle defenses as well as they could build them, and these were excellent forces and had the expertise to help shape the defenses, which is why Waco even held out as long as it did, while other places in America didn't have this luxury. Also because predominantly the PLA forces operating in the area were on the lighter end of the 68th PLA Group Army's forces, with their heaviest and most powerful formations in the south operating against Fort Hood. However, there were still some relatively heavy elements like the 8th Independent Brigade as well as the 38th Infantry Brigade, although not nearly as powerful as the 17th Armored Brigade in the south, along with the 203rd Artillery Brigade, as well as the 112th Combined Arms Brigade, as well as the Air Defense Brigade within the 68th PLA Group Army, all of them being located at the Fort Hood Battle. Those were very powerful formations. But the 8th Independent Brigade and the 38th were also relatively potent, and the 288th Light Infantry Brigade Division was a division that was relatively large, but it was on the lighter end, and it was as large as these two brigades combined, but again, its forces were more oriented towards fighting in thick wooded areas and jungles or mountains, and their equipment reflected this, although they were excellent for the type of fighting that occurred in the northern Waco battle space, where they had subdued armed reactionary civilians in multiple engagements and crushed them. And they had powerful artillery in the form of their PCL 181s, which helped in this area and beyond the battle space, as multiple battalions weren't even counted among the number of forces in the Waco battle, because the 24,500 were only they that were within the metro area, including this battalion from the 288th 13th Light Armored Brigade, with the rest of the 7 other battalions off the map, with 2 between Fort Hood and Waco, and the rest in a crescent who weren't counted in this battle, although they would have contributed relatively heavily with their light tank forces and armored infantry type elements. They were used to guard the flanks of the entire operation as a whole, and they helped provide security around I-35 between Fort Hood and Waco, and were needed there. As the forces that begun on other CCP properties had moved into the battle space belonging to the 38th especially, they had surrounded and destroyed these mixed American elements, with very few that crept along the Lake Waco making it to downtown, with the combat engineer forces from the former 91st Brigade Engineering Battalion, as many of its companies had been intermixed within these different mixed American units, with the last surviving members of it making it into the perimeter and taking control of the defenses. As that was occurring, the strikes became ever more heavy with the rocket fire, and the 8th Independent Brigade sent in its 2 armored battalions and its mechanized infantry battalion freshly after clearing the I-35 area adjacent to where it had begun, as well as the combat engineer battalion from the 38th moving in and establishing a position on the southern end of the line of contact, with the 2 Russian battalions having had pursued the mixed American units, entering at 5 and making it to downtown by 5:30, establishing the armored battalion's position on the corner of the defenses of the Americans, with the mechanized infantry or armored infantry battalion essentially moving in between the combat engineers of the PLA's 38th Infantry Brigade and the mechanized infantry battalion that had destroyed a large number of the mixed American forces. As we go to the map, there's a lot of actions and activities occurring on this map. The fighting very much resembles these images, as some of the American armor is present in this fight, as only 4 main battle tanks that were from their former heavy companies, most of them already destroyed by this point, making it into the downtown pocket and participating, one even managing to destroy a Russian T-80 main battle tank. This being a T-80, being heavily armored with the Contact 5 explosive reactive armor, some of the best in the world, along with the ERA kits and NERA kits available to the PLA as well. As these Russian forces were entering, they were adding numbers to the perimeter forces that had surrounded the American troops after they had fought their way through Fort Hood, and their last unit having destroyed was a squadron from 3rd ACR. It was the 1st Squadron. As these forces now were engaged in the fighting in downtown, the battle was taking on a more deliberate and tedious and methodical approach, as the forces were gradually moving through areas. Although they wanted to go fast, they knew if they did so, they would lose more vehicles, and they were not willing to do that, as they were casualty averse and would prefer to make their efforts drastically more careful and cautious as in their approach to overcoming the American forces, and they called upon heavy artillery strikes to eliminate the vehicles as they emerged from the several different parking garages in the downtown area, including one being located near their defenses on the corner of their defense lines. As the defense lines extended all the way to Lake Waco to the west of this area here, the Russian armored forces, including one of their tank companies, and there's 3 of the 4 tank platoons pictured in this area, one off map on another city block, and the armored infantry companies had dispatched their dismounted troops to clear these city blocks of enemy personnel, although the enemy personnel had constantly harassed the troops at the line of contact by using the underground network of sewers and drainage tunnels from which they would take cover from the enormous barrages of artillery fire and other strikes. They would come up out and fight the PLA and Russian troops in some areas of this line of contact. It would actually take 2 hours just to clear a few city blocks in this particular area, as the defenses were beginning to stiffen, and they were now beginning to build cohesive lines of defense as they basically radiated from the Alico building, which was now the headquarters of the American forces, which was Waco's tallest building, much of it horribly gutted and defaced from the massive artillery bombardments. Although it wasn't deliberately hit dead on by a precision strike, all the strikes in the general vicinity of it had horribly gutted it. But later on, it would be hit by cruise missile strikes as the command center, as it was identified as such. But for a time, other American command and control centers were being hit by cruise missiles fired from the YJ-18C or Caliber Club K container-based cruise missile systems, timed to fire off in salvos when their targeting data could be updated as the modern fluid battlefield conditions changed. And that data could be sent via AI to these targeting systems within the containers. As the ISR network directed everything from the Russian and Chinese quadcopter recon drones that monitored the lowest parts or the most localized parts of the battle space, all the way up to the high altitude ISR assets of the orbiting drones like the WZ-7 and the CH-4A armed recon drones, one even participating in this battle while the Wing Loong 2s had returned to their CCP properties to be rearmed with more missiles, as these even carried more than the combat drones, the dedicated Wing Loong 2 combat drones. They would come in and fire missiles to support the ground troops. And the highest assets being satellite, all the way down to the lowest being the squad level and up quadcopter reconnaissance drones. They were helping with the coordination of precision mortar strikes on enemy positions, as well as finding targets for the high-altitude recon drones and even Wing Loong 2s in previous battles, as well as the loitering munitions, which the Russian and Chinese loitering munitions were striking targets. As the Russians fired their loitering munitions from their headquarters companies within each battalion, the Chinese fired theirs at the battalion level, but they could fire more at a time than could the Russians. The Russians could fire 5 at a time from their track-based, 5-railed system for firing their Lancet 3s, which were highly capable loitering munitions, true enough, but they were being fired in smaller amounts. But the benefit to this was they could be reloaded quicker, but the Chinese could fire much more at a time with their TEL-based truck-mounted system, with which 48 fired at a time. The Chinese loitering munitions and Russian loitering munitions in this instance were armed with high explosive anti-tank warheads due to all the rubble and also bunker-type systems and armored vehicles they were expected to encounter. As the American airborne troops, ordinarily equipped with their Army high-mobility vehicles, their ground vehicles, these being the M1297s, they also had the M1301s as well, but primarily they had been re-equipped with Max Pro MRAPs. As these were a bit stronger and could resist more damage, they could easily be destroyed by loitering munitions, tank, IFV fire, and even, of course, the humble infantryman firing his rocket-propelled grenade systems at certain parts of the vehicle, or even more powerful anti-tank missile systems like the HJ-08, for example, or the Russians firing their Kornet. The Russian armored infantry troops had their AK-74M rifles, their RPK-74 squad automatic weapon, basically their light machine gun, and they had their 25mm tube-fired grenades from beneath some of the rifles, and also they carried the RPG-29s and RPG-32 systems, which are also highly destructive, and their Kornet was also carried by the occasional soldier that could be set up on a tripod mount and fired, just like the Chinese could carry their HJ-08s, but they also carried their enormously, freakishly mass-produced Type 69 RPGs. And they use these weapons, with the Chinese having a 35mm barrel-fired grenade as well as hand grenades, to clear many of these rubble piles. As the dismounted troops, there was 2 platoons from one company of mechanized infantry with their other platoon off-map, clearing the area just to the south of this city block, with this being a squad from that platoon clearing these buildings and now moving up. As these dismounted squads, 2 here and 2 here, came from this platoon, with one in the infantry fighting vehicle, which itself, at the opening of this map, has run over, although they had excellent ISR and saw a lot of what was going on, they did not see the improvised device that was well hidden and camouflaged beneath all kinds of rubble, so it looked like rubble itself, as well as a double-stacked anti-tank mine. There was the American anti-tank mines present there was a small supply of. They put a double-stacked anti-tank mine in this hole, one on top of another. And as this IFV ran over this mine, which was also camouflaged, these 2 mines on top of each other blasted off the tracks and did enormous damage to the undercarriage of the vehicle, as it was much less armored, but still relatively well protected, but much less armored than the side and especially front, but also even the back. The roof being the weakest point, as well as the undercarriage, but the undercarriage was still relatively well protected. None of the troops had been KIA'd, but the damage had been done to the front left side, and the vehicle had to be armor recovered by the armored recovery vehicle coming in, the Type 84, and pulling it out. As the troops would pull security over this area, they had to secure it first, although the shrapnel from the improvised device, which some of the Americans had skills and could craft these at short notice, while others were already pre-crafted prior to the invasion kicking off, but they were still in relatively short supply. And although it was not completely unheard of, some were used in different parts of the American battlefield. But this early in the invasion, there were not that many available and not in the numbers sufficient to cause any real damage to the PLA forces. And this improvised device did no damage to the IFV, as it was extremely well armored, again on its sides, front and back, with the front and sides being the strongest, and it did very little damage to the IFV, although the mines did the most damage, blasting off the left track, as well as also causing enough of a concussive wave to throw around the troops inside the vehicle and give them head injuries, back and neck injuries, and they, along with their vehicle, would be towed out of the battlefield, with the rest of the platoon continuing on with the fight as they would advance. This entire battlefield was a massive battlefield of a 1 by 1 mile area, but there was a lot of defenses in this area. When I say massive, I'm referring to all of the sandbag emplacements, all of the rubble battle positions that had to be taken from here, 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 and here, and beyond. They had even held earlier positions under I-35, as they had placed sandbag emplacements around the support beams between the streets and held those, but they abandoned those as soon as they saw the PLA coming, as they began to arrive in strength. As they had already been in the area prior and they were already contesting I-35, they had started arriving in strength and made a push for I-35 and had cleared I-35 with their 2 mechanized infantry platoons here and 1 off the map of the 3 combat platoons that comprised the company, with the headquarters platoon off map. In this area, there was a tank company from the armored battalion and 1 of the 2 armored infantry companies supporting the armor, mutually supporting tactically, as the armored infantry's job essentially was to support the armor in any type of assault. And these forces would begin clearing some of the buildings on the periphery of the defense lines, as well as rubble pile positions that used to be buildings, and the fighting would be savage, as the armor would support them with a heavy volume of tank shell fire, as 125mm shells blasted this bunker that had been built on the edge of this rubble pile and turned into a machine gun and an anti-tank position with a man with a javelin inside, as anti-tank ammunition was rather limited and it had to be conserved. The AT-4 was a much more numerous system and was relatively well dispersed among the troops. As this was the case, these troops were basically using the AT-4s in much higher volume than they did the other anti-tank systems like the TOW and the Javelin, which the Javelin often had to be used in direct attack mode, which meant that they had to use it without the infrared sighting system for seeking targets, due to the fact that the Chinese tanks had, and NZBDO-4As had IR and laser scrambling, making it exceedingly difficult for some of these anti-tank systems to directly target them. The top attack mode of the Javelin was essentially null and void against the PLA armor and IFVs, although it could be used successfully against their armor personnel carriers, which didn't have these types of defenses. The fact that the scrambling obscured the targeting capabilities of these systems, even the M1 Abrams tank, which had a laser rangefinder, made it very difficult to successfully target these tanks. Even in direct fire mode, the ERA or NERA kits placed on the tank, adding additional protection from such anti-armor weapon systems, almost guaranteed the tank's survival in direct fire mode. But The top attack mode was the best way to destroy a tank by going through its roof, but this was, again, not really possible against the PLA forces, although they could do it to the Russian tanks. But in the case of this Bradley right here, they did fire a tow missile and destroy this lead tank of this platoon of 5 tanks, and an armored recovery vehicle could manage to get through and recover the tank with the other tanks going around and continuing their attack. Starting with the Russians, as there were so many activities going on at the same time, the 3 Russian tank platoons of the 4 tank platoons that made the tank company, along with the headquarters platoon further back, were clearing the area with the armored infantry from one of their armored infantry companies within the armored battalions, supporting them by clearing the flanks of these advances of their vehicles, clearing rubble and also buildings that had not quite been destroyed yet. As humongous areas of the city had been saturated by this point with artillery fire, other areas had not yet been struck completely, like this building that's been gutted on its end, some of it having survived, as there's portions of the building still left, and complete city blocks here that hadn't been destroyed, although this area has been gutted with this building and another off the map. This has been gutted with a strike right in the street here, damaging horribly both buildings. But most of these areas have been reduced to rubble. Also at the opening of the map is a massive creeping rocket artillery barrage with the opening rockets striking this area right here, destroying many troops and vehicles, with the forces that are on the periphery of the strike being wiped out instantly, like these troops, these personnel right here. This vehicle's being horribly damaged. This Bradley, these personnel are all KIA'd from the strike. This vehicle, this M113, is completely destroyed with its M250 cal mounted and all these troops with it. Personnel in this area using this rubble as a fighting position. This Bradley being destroyed by tank shell fire after they destroyed this lead tank. The follow-up tank moving around, firing around it, destroyed it with a 125 millimeter tank shell. While this bunker's also been destroyed by tank shell fire, the Russian armored infantry have gotten in here and they're exchanging fire with these forces here, and they finally overcame them with the help of the tanks. While over here, these Russian troops had finished clearing these buildings, and then they mounted a firefight initiated from this building inside here against this rubble pile as their ISR assets could see the troops moving around, including those belonging to the armor, the tanks. The tanks laid down fire, including these tanks here, and these tanks could fire around here, but eventually they'd all have to back up as their lead tank would be destroyed by this M1A2, firing over the sandbag position and destroying this lead T-80 tank. But this Abrams would be destroyed by the follow-up shell coming from the T-80 behind it. The T-80 firing a Sabo round and destroying the M1A2. With a loitering munition, a Lancet 3 coming in and destroying this Bradley, with this vehicle being destroyed shortly after by another tank shell. As the troops cleared this building and the tanks began to come around and stop here temporarily, the troops then, after firing at these forces with tank shells too, coming from their armor, support from them firing HE ammunition at these forces, they then proceeded to attack and assault this position after they had laid down enormous volumes of fire from this building. They had 2 squads go in. One squad laid down fire while the first squad on the first floor bounded across. As they were firing over their own troops and hitting these personnel, they held their fire and then went down and joined in on the assault with grenades, 25 millimeter barrel launch grenades. Their small arms fire with their 5.45 by 39 caliber weapons, their RPK light machine gun essentially, and their AK-74M rifles. And they had overtaken this rubble pile that was part of a building, a gutted part of a building. And they overcame these forces here like they overcame these forces here after storming this rubble pile in the same way. And they had some help from loitering munition strikes with their heat warheads able to penetrate certain portions of rubble as they could penetrate certain things. These missiles coming from off-map are the YJ-18Cs or the Caliber Club Ks from the container-based systems firing off in salvos at specific command and control targets. They've long since passed over here. They're just here at the opening of the map, and they hit their targets in downtown. As the creeping barrage began here, many KIAs from this. Underneath this blast icon of rocket strikes from 122mm rockets, they did a time on target technique where the multiple batteries, which consisted of multiple launchers, 8 per battery, firing all at this area, the whole battalion, just saturating this area at the same time with artillery fire from their rocket artillery. Whereas the troops were busy trying to capture the initial rubble pile positions, the PLA troops moving in this area here, separated from the Russians, as their armored recovery vehicle comes in here, they were separated by a street, as this was a pre-agreed upon separation to keep their forces safe while they were cooperating together, as they didn't want any possible friendly fire incidents, although the AI systems that the PLA had prevented that, and it linked together with the Russians, their allies, who had their own systems too, in that manner, and they worked together and cooperated effectively. And the PLA fired at these personnel, supporting the Russians who were also firing at them, but the Russians mainly wiped these personnel out as their tanks wiped out this bunker, although there was fire at this bunker from this APC, from the heavy machine gunner on the APC, firing 12.7 fire. The tank shell is what really did it, along with the troops firing down at it. As the PLA forces were moving up, they were taking fire initially from the enemy forces on this rubble pile, as these forces had moved around after their vehicle had been recovered that had been horribly damaged from the double-stacked anti-tank mine, and although the improvised device did little to no damage, I mean, it really just pretty much scratched the paint. But the mines is what really caused a lot of damage against the men inside. It injured them badly. As they moved ahead, they laid down heavy machine gun fire, and precision mortar strikes were called in on the exact locations of these forces where they popped out of the rubble from. And 120 millimeter mortar fire from the PLL-05 platoon within the same battalion that this mechanized infantry company was a part of. This was the mechanized infantry battalion. This was a company from it. It also had its fire support company, which had a platoon of PLL-05s and 2 platoons of 130mm light artillery multiple launch rocket systems, the Type 63s, not to be confused with the Chinese Type 63 APC, which is another type of armor personnel carrier. These are Type 89As. This, after it had been destroyed by a Russian tank shell, this Bradley, these sandbag emplacements here were just basically originally held by the Bradley, which was already being damaged by shrapnel from behind it from the rocket strikes and debris. But the tank shell from the Russians is what finished them off, as the precision mortar strikes, multiple mortars hitting this area. This wasn't just 4 here, this was multiple coming in, as well as right here. There was a few that hit right in this area to wipe these personnel out holding this position, as well as Russian tank shell fire getting these 2 guys on the end, and Russian fire wiping these personnel out here. So loitering munition got the Bradley, a Russian tank shell retaliated against this M1A2 that destroyed their lead main battle tank here, and loitering munition strikes helped with the capture of this rubble pile here. 2 came in here and 1 came in here. And as they had destroyed these forces with tank shell fire and a loitering munition strike, behind the line of contact, there was more fighting going on with loitering munition strikes. The CH-901A hit this Bradley right here. This armor personnel, this MRAP of the the 143rd Infantry Regiment's 1st Battalion, one of its comprising companies, is operating MRAPs in this area. It's Bravo Company, and it hits this MRAP and destroys it. This Lancet 3 crashes into it on AI target seeking mode, just like the CH-901A loitering munitions. The CH-4A, the high-altitude reconnaissance drone that was heavily armed with 16 missiles apiece, was firing its last missiles, as there were 2 of these drones, while the Wing Loom 2s were reloading their missiles at the nearest CCP property where they had taken off from. These forces fired, or this drone fired at these forces 4 CM502 KGs, and they destroyed these 2 Striker Dragoons right here with 30mm autocannons that were behind this building and using the building as some kind of cover from enemy fire from here. But the drone destroyed these 2 Striker Dragoons from 2-3 ACR. They're comprising forces as they had been part of this mixed element, as well as the different companies of the 143rd's 1st Battalion, like Bravo Company here. They had lost a MRAP to a CH-901A, and a CM502 KG hits this MRAP behind this sandbag emplacement. There are so many barriers of destroyed vehicles or abandoned vehicles that have been pushed into the way, which is what these are here, and sandbag emplacements, as well as machine gun nests and also rubbled fighting positions made by each individual soldier or armed reactionary civilian, and from which they could hide in, take cover in, and fight from. And the fighting over them was intense, as this dismounted squad from this platoon is moving through this area. They're firing up. They have their weapons staggered. They're facing off to the left and to the right, and they're firing up at these forces who return fire at them, while this squad, as they lost a soldier from this improvised device. It did KIA one of their soldiers from these 2 squads moving under the bridge that had been dismounted earlier after taking this area here, as the Americans abandoned it to go to better positions. They had moved in and they had moved up here to provide fire support for their other for their other squad of their same company from the other platoon moving here. And the platoon threw grenades and fired up while they fired over their head. All of this ISR directed and got these forces at the same time as this was happening. It has to be understood that the Chinese tank platoon over here that's being engaged by these forces had fired a 125mm shell and just ripped right through this Bradley and destroyed it. And these troops in the sandbag emplacement, another tank shell, frag T shell flew in and just KIA'd all of them that are in front of these barriers, but behind the sandbags between these 2 former buildings. While these troops are wiping out these personnel here, and they have some vehicle fire support from their machine gunner on this Type 89 APC who KIAs these men right here on this end, while the troops, both on top of the rubble firing over their men safely, while the men throw grenades up and fire up at these troops, they wipe out all these personnel. As you can see, there's quite a few of them in here. There's about 8 of them that are wiped out by this squad and this squad cooperating together through their ISR capabilities, letting them know they're there. As this vehicle had been moved again, these vehicles had moved up into the area. They had taken some fire from the remaining forces here, but they had returned fire and wiped them out. This is before the Russian armor, which is now proceeding this way and also this way after this tank had been recovered. The 4 other tanks are moving up this way after these forces had been destroyed. And after the heavy mortar strikes and also the PLA fire from their vehicles wiping these personnel out, and also Russian fire wiping these personnel out with the help of Chinese mortar strikes, these forces now are beginning to move into this area. As all of this is going on, other things are going on in the battlefield. These armored infantry dismounted squads from the Chinese tank battalion's armored infantry companies, they had 2 armored infantry companies, are assisting this tank company. They have 4 tank companies, and of course they have their anti-tank company firing HJ-10 anti-tank missiles into the area, destroying targets along with the artillery strikes. These forces are now about to move around these buildings that they had cleared but came back out of because they didn't want to move up too far ahead of their other forces that could support them. But now that the tanks are coming forward after destroying this M113 and these dismounted troops behind this barricade, tanks are moving forward after firing 125mm shells and just shredding this thing up with a single shell, but also hitting these forces in the progress at the same time in the process. They're moving up, and they have their tank support also from the other platoon. There were 4 total firing this way and destroying this vehicle. This Bradley's been destroyed here with the troops behind it, as well as loitering munitions literally hitting them at the same time with the heat warheads, wiping out this squad in a double column rolling shield formation behind their vehicle, these 2 half squads, hit by loitering munitions and tank shells before these forces move around. And now, As that's happening, there's 5 Americans coming this way and 8 coming this way. These are armed reactionary civilians, and they're firing around the corner. They get one of the PLA troops, but because they're in a double column formation of 2 squads coming around at the same time, they grease these guys. Well, this squad coming around, it takes fire from these 8, but they return fire heavily, and this is after the tanks had destroyed this vehicle right here, which was a Stryker infantry carrier vehicle with a 50 cal on it. And there's troops behind this building here. They'll end up being KIA'd once the squad begins clearing this building. They'll be fired down upon, have grenades dropped upon their heads, literally. And that's after the tank destroyed this. They come around, they grease these 8 guys, these 8 armed reactionary civilians coming out of this manhole cover. But they got one of the squad members of this squad as they're on this side and the other squad's on this side. And now the squads break up and clear this building while the other squad clears this building after eliminating these personnel. This has been a feature of the battle here as personnel and Americans come up out of these manhole covers after heavy artillery barrages, or they do the same thing as the line of contact moves forward. They come up and try to harass the PLA forces as they advance. That's why the PLA is taking things relatively slowly. They have all kinds of instances where there's been Molotov attacks or traps, and they try to prevent this by moving methodically and slow, letting their ISR assets thoroughly monitor an area, calling in enormous artillery barrages before they move, getting all the enemy vehicles they can, while some would retreat back into the garages. Not all the vehicles have left the garage either. They keep some in there because they want to preserve their vehicles, because they know the PLA is going to strike some of them. And in this case, there's vehicles from the mixed military elements comprising 14 total M113s and Bradleys and Strykers all mixed together. There's 14 of those different types mixed together. And then there's 3 main battle tanks. There's a 4th one as well, but it's not in this particular map. But this tank's already been destroyed by the Russian tank, by the Sabo round. The American tanks operating here, one will manage to barely survive, while the other is going to be hit so heavily by rocket artillery fire, as well as all the loitering munition strikes coming in and PLA tank fire coming down from the street. This tank's just going to be decimated. I mean, it's going to be gone, while this other one will barely survive and cling on right here. And although it won't be struck by artillery, it'll continue to hold this city block for a time. And there's sandbag emplacements here where there's going to be a loitering munition strike at the opening of the map on this MRAP belonging to the Bravo company of the 143rd, whereas this one is going to be hit by a tank shell and also a CM502 missile coming from the drone, as the other CM502 destroyed this Stryker Dragoon, and this Stryker Dragoon was destroyed, while these group of troops here alongside the armor, but they move out, is destroyed by another CM502, which horribly damages this remaining portion of the building. Defaces the facade of it pretty horribly, while these 2 loitering munitions and a tank shell flew in and destroyed this from another tank platoon. There's a few other tank platoons because there's another company up here, but there's also another platoon of this same company as the tanks move forward. These troops launch a kamikaze Molotov attack, or not troops, I'm sorry, armed reactionary civilians. They come down from this rubble pile and this rubble pile, as this vehicle had been lost, not just to being so close to the artillery barrage. This Bradley right here had been lost also due to the tank fire destroying it. And they had come out as they were in front of the barriers, but they weren't behind anything other than the rubble. They come out off the rubble and they run at these tanks and they douse it with Molotovs as they're getting cut down by the coax machine gun fire of the lead tank they Molotoved and the turret gunner, who's now on fire and gets out and rolls around on the ground after the machine gunners had already cut down these troops. And the tanks behind them, they take the crew in, and the guy, after he puts himself out, just barely, he's badly burned and makes it to the next tank right behind them, while the lead tank's now on fire. So the PLA lost a tank, and the Russians lost 2, and the PLA lost a badly damaged ZBD-04A, but it will be able to be repaired, but their tank will not, as it will be completely destroyed and ammo will begin to cook off. So these tanks now have to wait on this tank to burn out. While this armored infantry up here had helped with exterminating these personnel, along with the lead tank and their machine guns, their coax and their turret gunner, and this ZBDO-4A was firing at them, although they fired back with an AT-4, which hit the ZBDO-4A. It didn't destroy it, but it damaged it somewhat. But these troops in the rolling shield, the lead troops were wounded a bit because the AT-4 hit on the left front side. These two lead troops just barely around it got wounded from some of the shrapnel. So this soldier KIA'd. They lost a KIA to the improvised device over here and a few wounded in action. They already had a bunch of WIAs inside the vehicle, as they all have now brain injuries, brain damage, and their back and neck injuries, and they had to be medically treated. The combat medics that are with this squad are going to pull out the KIAs and treat a few of the wounded, as they also had fired upon early on in the machine gun nest here and had destroyed it with tank shells, but the lead tank was now Molotoved, and the AT-4 was fired at these guys, who cut them down with 30mm autocannon fire in conjunction with the small arms fire and tank machine gun fire with their heavy machine gun and coax. They just cut these guys down quick, but they did manage in the short time they had to live Molotoving this tank, which is why the PLA is being methodical, because they've lost several vehicles already and they want to cut down on their vehicle losses. This squad here in the wedge had already gotten into within grenade range of these troops and was fighting over this rubble pile and storming it, while at the same time they were assisting in firing on these troops here until the artillery began to land and struck them. This began at the opening of the map. They were exchanging fire with them while they were in a wedge, because this is a tactical formation. They can fire on two different sides, really three, because they can fire ahead too. And they were firing at these personnel, taking cover behind the sandbags. But when the artillery rockets began to come in, the 122mm rockets, they had KIA'd all these personnel. Along with all these personnel in this M113, all of this was destroyed. Vehicles damaged on the periphery, and 120mm mortars from the PLA 5 platoon of their fire sport company. These personnel were KIA'd here as these troops in the wedge came around. They didn't lose anybody after they wiped these personnel out, and the artillery got these guys along with their fire. They came around here and were now laying down fire on these personnel guarding this barricade with these personnel. They managed to KIA all of them. The tank shells are being fired at them as well as they move up. They're being fired into this rubble pile to support their troops who are supporting them. As these troops clear these buildings here, these vehicles are already destroyed by both tank shells, loitering munitions, but also even the missiles that were fired from the high-altitude, heavily armed reconnaissance drone that was now supporting them in the field with their CM502KG missiles, which were dual-purpose anti-ship/anti-armor missiles, anti-tank missiles, and they were very destructive. They destroyed this MRAP behind the sandbag emplacement. These troops were eventually KIA'd by the PLA soldiers, dropping grenades on them, firing out of windows down at them. They wiped them all out from this building. As the rocket barrage is a creeping barrage, this tank would survive, although the troops were hit by a missile that came up out of this manhole cover and were moving through the area, checking the area before trying to join the troops here that were holding the line here, which was overrun eventually. It took, again, a long time to clear these city blocks. They had to go through all kinds of different fortifications and rubble piles, and it was arduous. It was not easy, but they eventually pushed the enemy away from I-35, clearing this whole area, with these troops eventually getting to these barricades here to support their 4 armor personnel carriers that were left of this platoon that smashed through the barricade, while these Russian tanks that was left of this platoon, the 4 tanks, who had paused here, now moved here and smashed through the barricades here. This is after this barrage had ended and all these troops and vehicles were destroyed from it. And the creeping barrage that started was getting all these personnel in here. These were all KIAs right here in these rubble piles from the rockets' direct strikes on them. Other personnel were intelligent enough to run into the parking garage, although the top floors of it had already been severely damaged by earlier artillery strikes. The rocket artillery would damage and destroy the top floor even more, and eventually the floor beneath that would be badly damaged and destroyed, but the very bottom floor was relatively safe. As these forces were moving in the area, Russian Lancet 3 destroyed this vehicle, Chinese one destroyed this one, CH901A. Chinese one destroys this vehicle here, this Bradley by the gas station. Lancet 3 destroys this MRAP here. There's a Lancet 3 going off map at an enemy target. The creeping barrage destroys all of these vehicles, as the encapsulated red arrow shows. This encapsulated red arrow is this tank and these M113s and a Bradley. These 3 vehicles going with it, they're all destroyed as they get here by the artillery, tank shell fire, and more loitering munitions. This creeping barrage destroys all of these MRAPs that belong to the Bravo Company, all these mixed American military vehicles, minus this armored engineering vehicle that gets the hell into the parking garage. And these vehicles here, these MRAPs are all destroyed. All of this is destroyed. Everything from here and over is completely destroyed, except what's in the parking garage, although the parking garage takes severe damage, and also who can escape into the manhole covers. The squad, though, moves towards the gas station to try to reinforce troops up at the line, and they get destroyed with these buildings, as indicated by the red arrow encapsulated in red, the green arrow in red. They're all destroyed. As that's occurring, the Russian forces, as early on they had lost a tank here, this platoon had to back up out of here, which took time to coordinate, although they did contribute some fire over their destroyed tank at these forces here and ahead. They also had their other platoon coming through this area. There was one off map going through the other area. As they moved into this position here, they got to the sandbag emplacement as the armored infantry troops, having been in a long firefight from this building that was being engaged, counter-engaged by these Americans here that were eventually all KIA'd. There were 2 squads that went into each of these buildings and this rubble here of the armored infantry from different platoons, of course, and these 2 squads, one eventually rushed the rubble pile after it was softened up by Lancet 3 strikes and also the heavy volume of fire from the top floor of this 3-floor building at these forces from one squad there, while another squad bounded as the other squad tactically covered them, and then they held their fire once they got here and started getting within grenade range, and then they got to the first floor and bounded with them to attack this rubble pile. Same thing occurred here, long drawn out back and forth firefight, although here the firefight was shorter and the PLA helped with vehicle-based fire. And the forces then bounded here after wiping out these 4 Americans, whereas the tank fire just from the tanks that got here destroyed not just the American tank, but the loitering munition got the Bradley here, and then this M113 was destroyed by tank fire. And then they eventually crushed this sandbag emplacement and went right through it. The tanks and the troops here, the troops getting up here, and the tanks of this force right here, after they had gone around, they had gotten through this area and had taken some fire from the Americans, but they returned fire and wiped them out. They had to back up, get armored recovery, and then they came back. And then the forces here, after pausing here, coordinated their actions with these forces. They moved up first, and then they moved in here, while their troops, after capturing this, had assaulted this rubble pile on the flanks. And they finished off from here, after taking this rubble pile, they finished off these enemies here, and Chinese mortar strikes already got these personnel at the opening of the map. Then these guys were KIA'd by Russian fire on the end here. And all of this action, as these forces were moving in to reinforce these positions that they knew were being under attack, they had lost more troops from the Russian dismounts firing into them, the 2 squads that were now in this rubble pile, attacking them as indicated by this arrow encapsulated in blue. They're completely destroyed by the Russian infantry and tank fire. And then by that point, the Chinese artillery barrage has wiped out all these personnel here. They'd already been KIA'd in the opening, and there's even some KIAs on the end of this group right here that have been wiped out, being on the outer reaches of the barrage. Then these strikes wiped these personnel out and these personnel out, and all of the vehicles here are destroyed too. This whole creeping rocket barrage that begins here and goes this way, and it be already initiated right here, but it begins to basically get all these areas on and off map. They stay a certain distance away from the areas freshly captured by the PLA and the Russians, as each of these blocks had been fully captured by this point. But it took 2 hours to do all of that because they were trying to be methodical to cut down on their losses. Although they had total ISR dominance and superiority, to do all of this, even with all the loitering munition support and their air support from their drone and their heavy volume of artillery firepower, which was just gargantuan, it was mammoth and enormous, and the tank, the armor firepower, which was huge, and the infantry fighting vehicle firepower, which was substantial, along with the mobile fire support of the heavy machine guns on the turret gunners with the Type 89As, and the Russian BMP-3s that sat further back, the dismounted troops, as well as their MTLB armor personnel carriers, which also had 12.7 millimeter machine guns. The fire support was immense. And all of this fire, the superiority in firepower, had wiped out a huge number of American troops and vehicles, but many had escaped into the parking garage here, as well as others in downtown. There were several, and also underground into the network of sewers and drainage tunnels, and also into deeper bunkers and rubble piles that could withstand strikes, which there were some that were built up well enough that the engineers had built. All in all, though, the strikes would continue, and more personnel would be KIA'd over time, or severely wounded and unable to fight, and taken prisoner as a result. Oftentimes, as positions would be overrun, these men would be captured, and they would be medically treated, although the fighting was severe and people were losing limbs, and it was savage. It was horrifying. And the capture of these different positions cost lives. I mean, even though the PLA and Russians they lost very little in the grand scheme of things, the casualties meant a lot to the units who lost their men, as the fighting was savage. It was severe. I mean, even though the Americans lacked ISR capabilities, they put up the best fight they could, and they lost heavily. And the tens of thousands of civilians that were stuck in downtown lost heavily, as many of them had perished in these massive artillery bombardments. They were gone. It was only the defenders that were really living by the moment, as they could face extermination at any moment. As they would try to hold out as long as possible, they didn't lose the will to fight until the very last moment on day 2, late day 2. They didn't quite last the full 8 days, but they made it pretty close. But I-35 was now fully in PLA hands, and enough to where, after capturing these blocks here, enough to where when the external components were moving up, they could move up unharassed by American forces, as the PLA would be jealously guarding all of I-35, including the segment that passed through downtown. In the next downtown battle, we explore what occurs just to the west of this particular battlefield, where it's on the literal bend of the defensive line. As the fighting would be savage and continue for many more hours in the downtown area, mostly due to the cautious nature of the invaders, but also because the will to fight and the heavy lines of defenses produced out of the rubble positions and other resources available made the invaders decide to be far more methodical and cautious than they would otherwise be, where they could just battering ram their way in. They didn't want to experience any more loss than they needed to, and they decided to be very gradual and methodical about how they captured these areas as they went block by block, this being a 2-hour mini-map segment of the larger battle that was unfolding in Waco. From 5:30 to 7:30, this occurred as the sun was beginning to come up on day 1 of the invasion.